Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Kate de Bruin and it's a delight to be bringing to you this pre-recorded presentation which is part one of what I'd like you to know about the rationale for change towards a multi-tiered system of support. I'd like to acknowledge the lands on which I live and work and where I'm recording this presentation and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd like to specifically acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people communities of the Kulin Nation are the ongoing custodians of the lands on which Monash University, my workplace, stands. I acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the lands of the Australian Capital Territory, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and to Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are participating today. This presentation is going to look at the history that comes behind how the multi-tiered system of supports was developed. Multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS, are frameworks for inclusion founded on principles of equity and ensuring that high-quality teaching and support is provided on the basis of need to all students without exception. The starting point for the learning of all children within an MTSS is to have access to an age-appropriate academic, social, behavioural curriculum that's taught and assessed by regular teachers in general education classrooms alongside their peers within the local community. MTSS was developed after decades of research and policy reform that took place most notably in the United States, but also elsewhere, and that are now being taken up by countries around the world in system-wide improvement initiatives. MTSS is a whole-of-system and whole-school framework designed to ensure that support within schools and systems can be accessed by any student who needs it, and that this need is identified as quickly as possible to ensure a likely good outcome for that student. And every student is understood to be capable of learning and thriving at school with the right level of support. MTSS has at its beating heart these principles of equity and social justice, and these come from the history of human rights and disability rights reforms. So the origin story is actually bound up with the shift away from offering special education to students in separate settings following a number of legal and policy changes in the United States and in Australia. So because of this, I've put together a little presentation which has got some of that history so that you understand the rationale and why all of this matters so much about in terms of how we think about support and how we teach students and how we do this to ensure that they thrive and make good progress academically, behaviourally, and in their wellbeing. So in the 1970s, there were a number of international human rights treaties that had obliged all nations that had signed them to ensure that children were accessing an education. Yet many children with disability around the world continued to live in state or church-run institutions from birth, and these children were not having any kind of experiences that were overseen by education departments. So at this point in history, communities were starting to become aware of the neglect, the abuse and the exploitation that was taking place within these settings. And there were global movements for change that were gaining momentum. Two in particular are of note here. One was the deinstitutionalisation movement, which was a shift to have people with mental illness or with intellectual and developmental disabilities moving out of long-term residential institutions to live instead with their families and within their community. This was accompanied by the integration movement, which advocated for children with disability to attend their local neighbourhood school. Now, in the United States, the integration movement had actually been catalysed by a previous landmark court case that had prompted quite radical civil rights reforms. This began in 1951 when 13 African-American families joined forces and took the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, to court in a class action that was known as Brown versus the School Board. And you'll see in the picture at the top here, the Norman Rockwell painting, The Problem We All Live With, Little Ruby Bridges, a very famous picture of the civil unrest that arose as a result of her arrival in the school. It was a resounding win that established the principle that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, then it became illegal to require families, African-American families, to take their children and bypass local schools and go to another school. Instead, there was racial desegregation of America's schools. The legal principle, separate is unequal, arising from Brown versus the School Board, was later applied to another series of landmark cases, perhaps less well known, and these were brought about by parents of children with intellectual disabilities who had been denied school enrolment, either poorly educated in alternative settings or institutionalised and excluded from education altogether. Two cases, one in Pennsylvania and one in the District of Columbia, were both won in 1972, drawing on those findings of Brown versus the School Board, successfully arguing that the principle of separate is unequal also applied to the education of children with disability. These cases were won so resoundingly, and there were so many more cases in the pipeline around the country, that the US federal government acted quickly in 1975, enacting a federal law that affirmed the entitlement, the legal entitlement of every child without exception to a free and appropriate education in their local public school, and for individual education support services to be provided in the least restrictive environment. Now, of interest, in the same year, in 1972 in Australia, Whitlam came to power, and one of his first actions was to announce a schools commission, examining schooling in Australia and what would be required for an equitable and sustainable system. The committee for that inclusion was headed by Peter Carmel, and the Carmel report was delivered in 1973, including a section on special education. That section of the report was quite scathing in its finding that about 15% of disabled children were being institutionalised with no access to education at all, and that many others were receiving some kind of something deemed to be training that ran without oversight from education departments and bore little resemblance to what we would recognise as education. They also criticised a number of wasteful duplications of services and gaps in access to services, and the Commission recommended that education departments assume responsibility for the education of all children. So you can see those parallels there, requiring that education departments begin overseeing what was provided to all children in both countries. So deinstitutionalisation and integration therefore began with this aim for people with disability to live in their families and go to their local schools. We can look back on that period and recognise that there were limitations and failings in their implementation, but it is worth noting for a moment that these were substantial reforms, ambitious reforms, ones made with improving equity for people with disability and in mind. They were things that had never been done or imagined before. And I often like to take a moment to emphasise to people that when we embrace change and do things we've never imagined before, we have blueprints to draw on. We can look at the past and say, we've done this before, we can do this again. Now, under integration policies in both Australia and the US and elsewhere, many children began accessing an education that had previously been denied them. But a consequence of this was that schools and teachers were being asked to do work that they hadn't done before in educating children with support requirements that teachers hadn't ever had to do. So there was pressure placed by teachers and unions to develop funding models that would provide additional resourcing to schools to do this new work and provide this support to students. And the funding models that were developed at the time were contingent upon young people being diagnosed within one of the sort of state-approved categories for funding of a disability and demonstrating that they met the eligibility criteria for the severity of their clinical presentation. These models were implemented in Australia and the US and elsewhere, but I'm showing you these examples from Australian states, which may look very familiar to some of you. And what you can see that's immediately visible is the variability across the states in terms of what was funded. So children might gain or lose funding and therefore gain or lose access to support just by moving house, moving school. This wasn't a nationally consistent or scaled approach. So it was up to the states or the territories who run their own systems to define these funding models. I've deliberately not put the ACT categorical funding model up here because I'm not trying to shame any particular states for any of their gaps. I'm trying to point out to you the gaps and the inconsistencies and draw your attention also to a number of inefficiencies. So for a child to access this funding, they had to get a diagnosis. This often meant spending time on waiting lists for paediatricians and allied health. The process was quite expensive, which made another inequity for some families who couldn't afford it. So there were delays in accessing the funding, which meant that there were delays in providing that to schools who would then use it to enact the support. This meant that learning gaps would continue to widen, behavioural issues would continue to escalate, and there were also other restrictions on which students could access support. So some students got a diagnosis that sat outside these approved categories, so specific learning disorders, attentional difficulties. There were also students who got a diagnosis in an approved category, but who didn't meet that minimum threshold for impairment. So all of these students went without funding, which in most schools meant they went without support. So these funding models, I do want to emphasise, were very progressive in their day. They were very forward thinking in their day, but over time we've now been able to see how they're no longer fit for purpose. We know something else that's quite problematic about these funding models. While intentioned, what they did was they actually became a model of service delivery. So they didn't just fund the service, they defined the service. Here's how that happened. For a student to be eligible for funding, there needed to be a medical practitioner who documented the child's medical deficits. It was a very medicalised logic. If a student didn't succeed in learning, or if they misbehaved at school, if they had difficulties with self-care or engaging positively at school, this difficulty was assumed to be some kind of impairment, attributable to an impairment, a deficit within a child, a deficiency within a child, with no consideration of the accessibility or the quality of the curriculum or instruction provided to them. Therefore, it was assumed that these children didn't need what general education teachers were offering. They needed some kind of remedial services that couldn't be provided in the classroom because their needs were different to those assumed to be different to those of the rest of the children in the classroom. It was assumed it was a uniquely special need that was best met by being taken to separate places, pulled out of the classroom, taken to separate places, and grouped by disability to be given remedial services designed specifically to address the deficits associated with that diagnosis. These were typically provided in quite separate places and drove this logic of special needs. They don't need education, they need life skills, they need self-care. Now, in the US, they also had these categorical funding models in place. And what happened there was there was considerable pressure placed on the budget, which attracted scrutiny. This is because of one category in particular that grew very rapidly over time, and that's the category of learning disabilities. This skyrocketed in raw numbers and grew from about 1/5 of all students to nearly half of all students funded for a disability in a 20-year period. This attracted a lot of attention, placed a lot of scrutiny, and there were particular concerns that the process by which students were being identified with a learning disability was problematic and flawed. Let's consider what a learning disability is. It's difficulty in things like reading, writing, and mathematics. And the way that students were identified was using a process called the achievement IQ discrepancy. What this meant was there had to be a significant discrepancy between a student's IQ, which had to be in the normal range, and they had to have some kind of very low score in something like listening or reading comprehension or written expression or mathematical calculation. Let's look at an example. Here's a student whose full-scale IQ score sits in the middle of the normal range, which is the middle band of 68%, and whose basic reading skills are more than 2 standard deviations below this average. So under this, there was a significant a discrepancy identified, this student would have been deemed eligible for special education funding. But there wasn't any consideration about whether there had been sufficient actual teaching in their basic reading scores to account for that discrepancy. It was assumed to be a deficit within the student, and funding flowed, and off they went to the special ed room. There were many criticisms of the process. Waiting for a child to fail was one of them. Schools were unable to enact this process until there'd been sustained underachievement, which meant the learning gap had to grow and grow and grow, and no funding and no support could be provided until there'd been a sustained pattern of underachievement that warranted the diagnostic process. There was another particular area that attracted a lot of concern, and that was that this process was resulting in a disproportionately large number of children of colour. So the pressure on the budget and the disproportionate identification of culturally marginalised communities led to suspicions that this process was not robust. This led to further research. In essence, this research found that special education services delivered through categorical funding tended to result in students being provided with a different curriculum, a life skills curriculum, a functional curriculum, and that this curriculum was being offered instead of the academic curriculum, instead of being supplementing it. They also found that students were being pulled out of the classroom to go to the special ed room to access this, and that they never returned. They found that it was resulting in widening of learning gaps, and that it lowered the likelihood of school completion. It generated delays and gaps in service delivery, and it became known as the wait to fail model. Now, none of this was unique to the US. It was happening here as well. The rationale for change is really clear. Categorical models developed at least 50 years ago were well-intentioned, but they didn't deliver their aims of supporting schools to ensure disadvantaged and disabled children thrive. So the US legislated change 20 years ago, and we are now shifting to that here with needs-based funding. This is important. I've emphasised this because we can't really embrace a new approach and embrace change if we don't understand why continuing with the old way isn't an option. These concerns that I've outlined here were all instrumental in generating substantial research interest and reforms in the US and policy there. And when I see you in Canberra, we're going to start talking about how they have resulted in reforms here, needs-based funding, the NCCD, for example, and we're going to look at how that leads us to MTSS. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this interesting. I look forward to meeting you in Canberra and going into more depth about MTSS and this needs-based approach that we are embracing in Australia. And that's a bye from me for now.